This podcast is brought to you by Reimagine Radio, the online radio station that aims to give you information on disability and music. My name's Graham Wyman, the program coordinator with the Vancouver Adapted Music Society. Today I'm joined by Dave Simonton and Jim Meyer, otherwise known as Sticks and Tones. Thank you for joining us today, gentlemen.
Thanks, Graham. Good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you as well.
Otherwise known as.
Yeah, exactly, right? So, Jim, why don't we get started with you first? When did you start playing music, and when did you decide that you wanted to pursue a career in music?
Music has been in my life the whole time. My mom played piano, but my grandma was really kind of something special. And she had a piano, and when she started playing, like, it was one of those deals where the neighborhood would crowd around the living room in the front yard to hear her play. And she was one that, you know, any classical music book, just open it and she could play what was there. And as a kid, that amazed me because I started taking piano lessons as a kid, and I do not have that ability to just sight read anything. Yeah. So I'm even more awed at it now than then. My grandma and my mom, I think when I was in grade 6, got me an electric guitar. It was like the classic story. It was the demo model. It was beat up. Yeah. So it was $30 to purchase and another $15 to repair it, I think.
Right.
So that kind of got me into guitar, and that was pretty fun. I mean, it's always fun to play guitar, but I did sort of realize that that's not my calling. Yeah. And when I was in high school, I started playing electric bass and played bass in bands for quite a few years, and that just really felt like home.
Okay.
So then in the early 80s, I did see the version of King Crimson when Tony Levin first entered, and he's certainly the most famous Chapman stick player. Yeah. But I heard the music on the 3 albums that were released in the 80s, and I saw the band perform a couple of times. So I saw somebody play this Chapman stick instrument, and I thought, well, it's got all the bass there and a whole bunch of other stuff too. Mm-hmm. So the seed was sown, and then it was some years later, I saw an ad in the buy and sell here back in the days of text only, so there was no photograph or anything. And it was just a little ad that said use Chapman stick. And I drove to Mission and met the guy. Gar Riggins was his name. He mostly played keyboards in a band and strapped the Chapman stick on, and from time to time would play bass parts with this hand and keyboard parts, bass with the left hand and keyboard with the right hand. Yeah. And I just fell in love with the instrument right away, so I brought it home with me and noodled. I had a job at the time, so it's not like I had a ton of spare time, but I noodled, and sort of years went by. And then a fellow here in town, Nathan Aswell, a good friend, amazing vocalist and bass player and stick player, decided I didn't know him, but he was on the same path as me. How am I going to learn this thing on my own with no teacher and no instruction book? Right. So in the mid-'90s, he organized a couple of stick seminars just off of Commercial Drive. Mm-hmm. And I went to those really not being able to play anything with my old beat-up, used Chapman stick. And it just changed everything for me. And I think that, I could talk about that for a week. But the one thing that stood out was I saw a number of Chapman stick players. 3 of them were professional, like full-time Chapman stick players, and then a bunch of guys who were at various levels of learning. Okay. And the instrument made so much more sense watching someone else play it. I know other people could learn from the book or learn from sheet music, but for me, seeing how the hands move and how you interact with it, that changed everything. And then I just decided, I have to do this one day. Mm-hmm. And then just to wrap it up, it was my birthday in 2000. I thought, okay, I've had this thing. I should either learn how to play it legitimately or get rid of it. Right. So I committed to playing every day. And a year later, I don't think I had played 365 days, but man, it was pretty close. I was really in the habit of playing every day. Yeah. And I thought, okay, it's time to upgrade. So on my birthday the following year, I ordered a new Chapman stick, which I think I waited 3 or 4 months for that to arrive. And oh man, a brand new instrument. It was just crazy how cool that was. So then I was completely hooked. Sorry.
No worries.
There we go.
Time's up.
So, yeah.
Interview's over.
And once I started to be able to play the thing, it was just so much fun. And then to play, with a drummer, to play with Dave, it's really cool to just have 2 people and sound like a band. It's just a lot of fun.
So you kind of alluded to this, but would you mind telling our listeners what the Chapman stick is? And yeah,
that would probably be helpful. The Chapman stick is named after Emmett Chapman. Mm-hmm. So in the 50s and 60s, Emmett was a jazz guitar player, played around LA a lot. He and Barney Kessel were friends and would jam together a lot in LA clubs and that. So in the jazz vein, and Emmett in particular, I would say his true love seems to be improvisation.
Right.
And then separately, Emmett's also a craftsman. So in the early mid-60s, he started building his own guitars. And then he started noodling with them. Okay. So he had a 7-string guitar and then an 8-string guitar. And by the late 60s, 68, 69, he's playing a 9-string homemade guitar that just didn't sound like anything else. That had some really low bass strings, but then guitar range strings. Mm-hmm. And in the process of noodling with it, he got the idea of separating the strings into 2 sets. So right. the original Chapman stick is 10 strings. 5 of those are like a bass guitar.
Yeah.
And the other 5 strings are like a guitar. So the left hand taps on bass guitar strings to play a bass line. Mm-hmm. And the right hand taps on the other separate 5 melody strings, we call it.
Right.
Guitar strings, if you want, because it's in the guitar register, but bass and melody, we say. So the stick is played by tapping the strings to the fret. So it looks like the neck of a guitar, frets and strings, mm-hmm. but you get to play 2 parts like a piano player would. So a lot of times playing, I am thinking a lot like a pianist. The left hand is going to play a bass line or maybe some chord thing or some accompaniment, and the right hand more typically would play a melody or like piano, maybe chords, whatever, and then mix and match. So it's the mentality of keyboards with an instrument that sounds much more like electric bass and electric guitar.
Right.
And then, as you guys know, then I plug into a pedal board, and that gives you a lot of variety, like a guitar player's sonic palette, more or less. Right. So 2 hands tapping, and you get to be bass player and guitar player at the same time.
And it's almost to, as you said, the keyboards, it's like encompassing 3 different instruments and kind of combining it into one.
It is, and I'm glad you said 3 because Emmett explains this really well too. A lot of times a stick player can sound like 3 people depending on your frame of mind, in that you may play on the very low bass strings a straight up bass line, which may be very simple, just a tonic or a root 5 or something, but something really low in the register. Mm-hmm. But then you have these other 3 or 4, or my Chapman stick isn't 10, it's 12 strings, so I have 6 guitar strings and 6 bass strings. Mm-hmm. And by the time I get to the highest bass string, it's pretty high up there. So I can play like on the low bass strings a bass part, and then maybe a chordal accompaniment, like maybe a piano player might do in the mid-range of a piano, mm-hmm. with the other fingers on the left hand. So a lot of times you can play 2 parts with the left hand and then a melody on top of it with the right hand. I don't do that so much. That's not super easy. But I think that was Emmett's original goal, was to truly sound like 3 people with 1 instrument.
Right.
Cool.
Yeah. So having known the both of you for a bit here of time, I know you both have quite an affinity for progressive rock music. And so what do you think it is about that style or genre of music that you two gravitate towards?
You want to take that one, Dave?
Gee, I don't know. I think it how do you explain one's taste? It's kind of a thing that I think for me, probably Yes was one of the first bands in Emerson, Lake and Palmer that I really heard that did that kind of music. And I was just blown away by the musicianship and the feel and the sort of changing times. And, it wasn't, not that I didn't like pop, but there was something very different about the experience of sort of fusion progressive music that just caught my attention, especially live. It was just so dynamic, and really the musicianship was astounding. And it's funny because I wasn't really much of a King Crimson fan, but I'd heard a bit of their work. I was more like Genesis, Yes, ELP, that sort of thing. And then before I met Jim, I went to see King Crimson with a friend of mine, Doug. They kind of dragged me there. I wasn't very keen to go, and I was just blown away. It was the first, I was right at the front of the stage at the Commodore.
Okay, yeah.
And Tony Levin was there, of course, and everybody in that band is just phenomenal. So that really changed my mind even to a higher degree about how much I appreciated that style of music. Mm-hmm. And then, when I was down at Granville Island one day, Jim was busking, and I kind of stupidly, shyly went over to him and said, "Hey, you know any King Crimson?" And of course he knows all those guys, and I realized that Jim's actually part of a cult.
Yeah, there you go.
I kind of went, gingerly around that, but
and now you have.
It almost felt that way because there was so much going on in the stick world that I just had no concept about that whole world, and but I really wanted to play. I hadn't really played with anybody that did that style. It had always been kind of four on the floor, pop rock music, and that was all I really knew. And so I asked Jim if he wanted to jam, and I think he was kind of like, "Well, what do you do?" So I think, but he was very open-minded about it. He came up to the studio, and at first it was very tricky for me because I think the first thing he said to me was play something in sevens.
Right.
And I really didn't know what that meant. I kind of have a vague idea, but he's a patient guy. He kind of kept with it, and I would take his CD and I went home and I just listened to it and tried to play along, and it was quite a bit of work, but it's so much fun to play. I just really, I like playing anything really, but that style has just been more challenging for me, and so I've learned a lot along the way, and I just think it makes me a better musician, a better listener. But I think once we get to a point where you really know the material, I don't have to think about it anymore. It just comes naturally now. So it's been a very cool thing for me to have this experience with Jim, because there's not many other people I play with that, other than you.
No.
When we're jamming, we go off on all sorts of different explorations.
Different tangents. No, there is something incredible.
Jim and I jam too. He usually comes up with the 11s or whatever it is we're going to do, but and that took a lot of time to get there where we feel comfortable with that. So, but it does take work. So anyway, that's a long answer to why I like progressive rock.
No, that's all good. No, there is something very satisfying about playing in an odd meter when you actually nail down a song.
I was thinking about that just listening to Dave talk, and I think a part of it is, especially when Dave and I met, I recorded with a drummer and I've played with at least a handful of drummers, and it's really great. But when I met Dave, I had been playing solo on a daily basis for probably 3 or 4 years. And I don't think I realized it at the time, but I fully enjoy playing solo. But man, when you add a partner to that, it's so much more fun. And just thinking of Dave talking about the progressive music, one thing is, not to slag any music that's simple to play, because simple is a goal for all of us. If you can do simple well, that's awesome. So this is not a slag at all, but it can be, all right, I'm going to strum these chords and you sing, and there we go. Where I'm just doing my thing and you're doing your thing, we're just doing it at the same time. But when Dave and I play, it's no, man, we have to work together or this is going to be chaos. So it's much more of a team kind of mentality. It's not, I'll do my part, you do your part, and we'll see what happens. It's, man, if we're not paying attention to each other and we're not on, and I wonder for musicians who like to play more challenging music, I'm curious now, is it the teamwork that appeals to you? It's like if it's 2 or 3 or 4 of us, man, we got to be tight or this doesn't work. And that's way more fun to me to like, ooh, okay, we're taking a risk right now. What's going to happen in the next 2.5 minutes, And that's really exciting. I wonder if that's what maybe draws us a bit to music that's a little more challenging to play, I guess.
Yeah.
Well, certainly, yeah. When you get there, when you do that work, it's yeah, it's just very rewarding experience to be able to play it and be, you know, maybe we're not as tight as we could be some days, but you know, when it's working, it's just a really rewarding experience.
No, I 100% agree. It's always like when you hit that last note and you're all together too, and you just look around the room and get that sense of like, okay, we got that, we nailed it. You know, there's always that very satisfying.
For sure.
So, Dave, you mentioned a couple of your influences, but I'd like to get a perspective from both of you. And with the material that you two do together, who would you say influences the stuff that you play? Because I know you play some Beatles tunes, Cyndi Lauper. But yeah, who kind of informs what you bring into the group that you guys play with?
Well, I immediately think of Bill Bruford. I mean, probably the drummer for Yes, like in the earlier days. You know, the Fragile album and the Yes album were just, you know, I just listened to those records over and over again. I listened to a lot of records, but for that style of different time signatures over different time signatures, you know, he would play in 5s or 7s, you know, when the band's playing in 4s or vice versa. Mm-hmm. And I just thought it was the coolest thing. I couldn't figure out what the heck was going on, but it all just flowed like perfectly together. Mm-hmm. So yeah, Bill Bruford for sure. I mean, you know, Buddy Rich, I was always a big fan of his, and I was fortunate enough to see him live 4 times. And, you know, that's a completely different style and nothing I would ever even aspire to, because I just don't have the hand function or the limb function to even, you know, but it's just such a joy to watch musicians that are so good at what they do. And, you know, like watching Jim play solo at Grand Blyland was awesome. Like, I didn't really anticipate he'd want to jam. I just thought, I got to ask.
Yeah. Because
that's a percussive instrument. Like, he just, as a drummer, I just think, man, that's going to be fun, you know. Mm-hmm. Challenging but fun. So, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of drummers and different musical styles that, you know, I grew up with, including pop. But I think, yeah, the Beatles and bands like, you know, the Shocking Blue, or even Paul Revere and the Raiders, you know, they had a certain thing going on that just, this groove that drew me into drums. And it was kind of a rebellious thing for me too, to go from piano to hitting things, you know, like as I think a 10-year-old, 10 or 11, I got my first snare drum and a tiny little cymbal that I took down in the basement, and I listened to 45s and I'd try to play along with them. Eventually when I was 13, I got my first drum kit out of the Sears catalog, actually.
Okay. Yeah.
$199.99. That's complete set with cymbals and everything. And it was a silver tone, red sparkle kit. And it was just Christmas morning, you know, it was amazing.
Yeah.
So, but, you know, it was pretty much, I was in a garage band kind of thing, and in grades 7 and 8, and we would play everything from Uriah Heep to Deep Purple to Iron Butterfly. Yes, I did the Inagata-Davida solo. So there were some progressive things happening in there and what we were actually trying to do. And half of our songs were originals, and they were just like songs like called The Barber, where the lead singer just screamed while he was getting his hair cut, and we were just making a lot of noise. So it's hard to sort of like look at all your influences, but it's like, you know, I did a thing with Simon the other day. We were picking songs that were our most influential. Well, every day that changes, right. You know, what I think about. So
yeah, it evolves.
But obviously I said Bill Bruford first, so that was obviously big for me, what was happening in with that emerging style, and ELP. I mean, Carl Palmer was a monster, very innovative.
Yeah.
I saw them live a number of times too, and just amazing stuff to watch. You know, it's an experience.
Did Carl Palmer inspire you to take your shirt off in the middle of your drum solo?
Yeah, before I grew all my back hair, I used to do that. So I've grown the beard now, you know,
yeah,
to
exactly.
balance it off properly. Yeah, Carl was quite an amazing. That trio was just unbelievable. That I tend to like, when I think of songs of theirs that are influential to me, it's Tarkus.
Yeah,
all the way.
100%.
Just that gradual build and that fast. I can't possibly do what he's doing there, but it's well, we'll jam on it someday. We'll see how it goes. Maybe we could figure that one out.
Yeah, have to get someone to play like Keith Emerson.
Yeah,
that'd be a little ridiculous.
The first band that I played in high school, the guitar player chose our name, Tarkus. And we printed up T-shirts and the whole bit, and it was kind of funny because there was no way we were ever going to play Emerson, Lake and Palmer. Well, maybe one of the acoustic guitar tunes, but you know, none of the challenging stuff. So it was sort of an odd choice back then, but clearly that was an influence on our guitar player as well.
Yeah. And
that band doesn't even have a guitar player.
Yeah.
So what were you listening to, Jim?
Clearly there was a lot of overlap, Dave, because I was a bit more into King Crimson than you are for sure, and I would have to add Rush in there, but I'm a bass player at heart, so Chris Squire of Yes, Geddy Lee of Rush, you know, Mike Rutherford of Genesis. I remember how crushed I was after being a big fan of the kind of Peter Gabriel era Genesis, you know, that sort of stuff. I read an interview with Mike Rutherford, and he said he just prefers guitar, so he never practices bass unless they're getting ready to record or they're on tour. And then he did become the guitar player in Mike and the Mechanics, but I thought, wow, one of my favorite bass players never likes to play bass. I thought that was kind of strange. But yeah, the same sort of progressive stuff, you know, maybe a few more obscure names here and there, but that same thing. And it's interesting you said Bruford, because I was literally just yesterday watching a Rush documentary, and they were interviewing Geddy Lee in the late 70s, and they said, what do you listen to? And the only name that he said was Bill Bruford.
Really?
Yeah, he said Bruford, you know, and the interviewer didn't know who that was. He goes, I'm not familiar with them. And he said, no, he was the drummer with Yes, and now it was during the era of Bruford, which was a 4-piece instrumental fusion band. And it was around that time that Geddy was.
Do you mean Earthworks?
You'll find 2 albums named Bruford, and then Bill Bruford's Earthworks was after that. But yeah, the same general era. So instrumental music with just an amazing drummer. I agree with you 100% on that. Bill Bruford is just so creative and different from so many people. And, you know, it's just, well. Yeah,
well, interesting that he used electronics too, and I had never considered that, but it was something I had to go to.
Right.
You know, and I saw Earthworks at the Commodore, and he used, you know, he had electronic and acoustic and different triggers everywhere, and loops and all sorts of things going on. The guy must have spent an enormous amount of time just programming his kit for each song he did. But I'm kind of curious for you, what about Weather Report? Where do they fit in for you?
For me, when I got into university,
like as a bass player, I'm thinking.
I met more jazz people than in high school. High school was pretty hard rock and the odd progressive stuff. But at university, yeah, Weather Report and a lot of those bands that sort of became the godfathers of that late 70s into the 80s fusion thing, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, Jocko, you can't be a bass player and not be amazed at Jocko. So.
Yeah.
No, I'm right with you, Jim. When the first Weather Report album I ever heard was Black Market. And yeah, that was like, I think my first year at Berkeley, and it was like, okay, off to the race horses with that one.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think it's funny. I'm kind of reminiscing now as a young musician. When you see one of your idols like that, and I still remember the first time I saw Rush in the 70s. You know, when you get home that night and you're sort of coming down from the amazing experience, you have this decision. It's like, is that guy so much better than me that I should just give up now? Or is it like, that was so amazing, even if I never attain that, it would still be really cool to just go in that direction. Yeah. And I can remember, you know, seeing King Crimson or Yes or something, Rush, and having to decide, like, okay, does that make me want to quit, or does that make me want to forge ahead?
Yeah. No, when I see things like that, even if it's someone unknown on YouTube that's just killing it, it's like, all right.
It's even worse when they're unknown, because then it's like, oh, somebody I've never heard of can do this.
Or like a 7 or 8 year old doing stuff like that, right? It's like, all right, back into the shed.
Yeah, you go through those stages for sure. But you know, when you find yourself in the studio jamming or rehearsing or whatever you think, it doesn't matter. No. You know, we're doing this, we're having a great time. That's, you know.
Well, Dave, like I'll tag on to that. I think we've played one time. Well, there's one in particular that stood out to me since COVID hit when you and I got together, and I think it was like we had a 45-minute straight jam and went all over the map. You know, whether it was like, you know, some of it was kind of straightforward, but then it was weird meters, again, same kind of style like you guys do, like 5/4s, things like that. And then again, it's just, I'll just go back to it. It's just so satisfying.
I know, it is funny. There is a hurdle there to get over. You know, because I know now I can play with you and I can play in 5s or whatever, and you will, you know, you just hear it and you can still play in 4, but you kind of know where it's going to evolve and where that downbeat comes up again. You know, that's why I love doing it, like with Jim or anybody that can, you know, there's a different cycle to it, a different kind of, I don't know, what would you call it? It's just a different structure that, you know, your brain just adjusts to. So I just, like I said earlier, it's like when you realize, I get it. It was like when we were practicing this 11s thing. I just couldn't find a way to do it that felt natural and that there was some groove in it, that it kind of worked with. And then, you know, we kind of, I mean, literally probably it took us about 10 rehearsals. Not that we played, that was the only thing we played, but we would work on it.
Yeah.
Probably about 10 times, wouldn't you say, Jim, before we started to get a sense of it?
Yeah, maybe a little sooner than that, but yeah.
But you could easily say, you know, that's, I don't think this is going to be doable, and just, you know, but there's something just enjoyable and fun in the process of getting there, like working on any set when you actually realize we got a solid 30 minutes here, you know, or whatever it is, we could, I mean, it was a little, when we did the show, we hadn't played in a long time, and I mean, it was still in there, but you realize, it's better when we can rehearse every week and just be on top of it, because it was more challenging than I expected, really.
I think what you were saying about groove is really crucial, because that's the thing, is you don't need to be thinking in your head what time signature you're playing in. You need to find how it feels right. And I guess one prog band that I'm sure we all like that hasn't come up yet is Pink Floyd. And I remember when Dark Side of the Moon came out, you know, Money was the radio hit, I guess. Yeah. And I cannot tell you, growing up in that era, how many times I heard Money on the radio. And it was probably 3 years later that I realized it was in 7/8. Yeah. And that was a revelation to me, because it's not, okay, I'm going to write something that feels awkward. It's like, I'm going to find a groove, and you find this groove, and lo and behold, it happens to be in 7/8, but that's not necessarily, you know, I don't think that was their intention for that tune. And I thought that's the trick, is it's not what the time signature is, it's can you make that time signature feel good and have a groove. And I think that's what we do well together, Dave, is, you know, we kind of find a groove. And, you know, maybe I think when we take a break and talk to each other, maybe there's a little bit more mathematical, you know, going on. But I think when we're playing, it's just about listening. And, you know, especially like the 11s thing you're talking about, we're creating that together. You know, I have an idea, but it's not really fleshed out, and we're both kind of working on it.
Yeah.
So we are trying to explore, hey, what'd you do there? Because that felt better than what we were doing before. And I think that's really fun, too, to collaborate on taking something that's a little clunky and awkward at the beginning and finding a way to smooth it out so that, you know, and then I remember the first time we played it live, it's like, okay, this is officially presentable now.
Well, gentlemen, I'm sorry to interrupt here, but we're just about to run out of time for this part one, and this is going to be a two-part episode for our listeners. But just as we're ending, we are going to be taken out with Kamuchia. Jim, do you just want to give a brief kind of chat about the song?
Yeah, my wife and I had, we spent a week in Cortona, Italy, in Tuscany, and the name of the song is Tuscany, and Cortona's up on a hill, and from the hotel we were in, you could look down into this valley, and Kamuchia was the name of the little town down there.
Yeah.
And the week was actually a conference of science-oriented people, science and engineering people, and artists.
Right.
And so it was, I think there was about 150 of us. Approximately half were PhD doctoral students in an engineering school in Switzerland. And the other half were musicians and artists and various other types. And the whole thing was to come together. So artists did technical stuff, and the technical people did creative things, you know, these workshops. And at the end, on the Friday evening, there was a performance.
Okay.
So I took it upon myself to compose a piece of music during that week. And I wanted it to represent these two things kind of opposing, but by the end of the conference, they sort of come together,
right,
and create a different thing. And in Kamuchia, in the middle section, is my attempt at trying to musically show these two different things kind of colliding.
Gotcha.
And how they might come together. So that's rare for me, and I do have to mention that I did write the piece of music that week. I was not a good enough stick player at the time to play it, so the performance itself was a little on the rough side. Gotcha. And it literally took me like 3 years to learn how to play the thing that I had written. Right. But I knew what it was, and so now that's just a very satisfying piece to play with Dave, because that piece doesn't work as well as a solo. But once the drums are in there, I think I like the way it covers a bit of ground.
Well, that's great. Well, thank you, gentlemen. And stay tuned next week for part 2 of our interview. This is Kamuchia. Stay safe and keep that music flowing.